Speaker, the past few months have been a challenging time. We've watched anxiously as the number of cases in Sydney and New South Wales continued to rise exponentially. We've watched with frustration as the leaders of New South Wales refused to implement sensible measures in a timely manner. And we've watched as gold standard Gladys has morphed into glad wrap Gladys. The reality is, Speaker, for a long while now, that it's been a question of when, not if, Delta came to Canberra. The consequences had already devastated our tourism and accommodation industry without federal support. It's a reality born from the irresponsibility in handling the New South Wales outbreak and from a desire to see political views triumph over sensible scientific advice. But it would be wrong to blame the Premier and Deputy Premier alone, because through this whole tragedy, they've been aided and abetted by the Prime Minister and his band of travelling COVID sceptics. And we need to remember the reason why we're having lockdowns right now is because quarantine wasn't fixed. This current outbreak throughout Australia and now New Zealand arises from one limo driver taking a foreign air crew, unvaccinated, without a mask, to hotel quarantine. And some months later, the whole of New South Wales is in lockdown, we in Canberra are in lockdown, and Melbourne and New Zealand now are also in lockdown. And the reason why the consequences of that failure are so great, of course, is because of a failure on vaccines, a failure to get that supply that was needed earlier this year. Now, the Prime Minister can crudely complain about the Premiers and Chief Ministers all he wants, but they have continued to have one hand tied behind their back because of the government's failure on quarantine and the vaccine rollout. As Malcolm Turnbull said, I can't think of a bigger black and white failure of public administration than this. Further to this failure, we've seen a series of irresponsible protests and marches, egged on by individuals such as the member for Dawson, with no genuine rebuke or condemnation of such irresponsibility. There's been a vacuum of leadership. But whilst we can't find that leadership upon the government benches, one need only step outside this building and into the community of Canberra to find some of the greatest displays of leadership. To the hundreds of trainee and retired nurses that answered the call when our health system was under pressure, I thank you. To our contact tracers and our Services Australia staff, including those that have moved from other jobs, I thank you. To the members of our community who have cooked meals for those isolating out of their own pocket, I thank you. To all Canberrans who have followed the necessary lockdown requirements to protect themselves and the community, I thank you as well. It's easy to be disheartened by looking at those who are supposed to be leading the country, but by taking a step back and looking at those who continue to support their communities through some of the toughest of circumstances, we find the true Australian spirit. It's these Australians in our communities that will get us through this pandemic, and they deserve to be recognised in this chamber.